Hello everyone, welcome back to part 3 of my interview experience with Capgemini. I already have shared part 1 and 2. If you haven't already gone through it, please go through it. The link will be in the description and in the pinned comment. So let's start. So before starting, I am very overwhelmed. So thank you very much for the overwhelming response. I already got 1200 plus subscribers in last 7 days. So it's really nice and encouraging. So you'll be getting better and better content from this. My channel name is .NET Decode, means I really want to decode .NET for every .NET developer. Okay, having said that, let's start with question number one. So the question number one is, uh, can you explain the request lifecycle end to end? So whenever a client sends a request, client can be Angular, React, anything. So whenever a request comes, the first thing it hits is the Kestrel server. Kestrel is nothing but a reverse proxy server. I will be, explaining this in part 5, where I'll be explaining other things along with it. So once it hits the Kestrel server, then it goes through different phases of middleware pipeline. Okay. Now, if you see here, we have different middlewares already injected in the application lifecycle. So out of all this, we don't have to use everyone, but depending on the situation, we use different middlewares. And middlewares are nothing but the chain after one another. So once it crosses through all the middleware pipeline, then it reaches to routing table. Routing table is the backbone, you can say, which actually decides which endpoint is going to be injected or called. So this is exactly where the controller will be instantiated depending on the incoming request. Controller will be instantiated and then action method will be called. Action method is the backbone in a sense that it has got all the business logic required for to serve that particular HTTP request. And through IActionResult or IActionResult T, I mean, I'll explain you what's the difference between these two. These are basically return type, the way we want to respond to the client for that particular aspect. And then the response will be sent back. So try to, explain the interviewer pretty much in the similar fashion. So a client then called, then it reaches to routing table. Routing table matches the request and send it to appropriate controller. Then controller will call the action method. That action method will be having business logic, which will execute and return the response. So that's question number one. Second question is, what is an action method? An action method is a potential endpoint. Okay. All action methods are endpoint, but not endpoints are action method. What I mean is, it is basically a simple public non-static method which serves the client, where all the business logic and everything will be there. And depending the way client wants the request to be served, it will do all the business calculation and return the response back to the client. Okay, you can see the code snippet of action method. Okay, so then there was a follow-up question on the same, that why action method cannot be static. So the reason here is very simple. If you observe, whenever we make a method static, it belongs to that class. Whenever you want to call a static method, if you remember the class name dot that particular method, what does that mean? It start belonging to that class. Okay, it doesn't belong to the instance of the class. If anything belongs to the instance of class, then multiple instantiated values can be served in that particular method. But here it cannot be. We make that method, particularly the action method, static, then that's not possible because DI container is going to inject dependencies to serve each and every request. So whenever a request comes, DI container will inject a new dependency through the constructor. So that's why it cannot be static. In simple word, one line, make it clear to the interview that whenever we make a method static, it start belonging to the class, not the instance of the class. And we require the instance of the class in this context because DI container needs to inject the dependency required for that particular controller or action method. Okay. Now let's move on to the next question. What is an endpoint? An endpoint is a runtime concept which basically represents a specific handler. You know, action method is also an handler, minimal API is also an handler, and razor pages are also an handler. So depending on the HTTP request, we redirect that request to different handlers. Okay. If the HTTP requires a action method to be called through the controller, then we will pass it on to the controller base endpoint, which is nothing but an action method. On the other hand, minimal API call can also be an endpoint, right? If you have seen the code, if you see here we are using minimal API to serve the client to send the response back to him or her, whatever you want to use that. So minimal API is also a endpoint. Okay, so minimal API also can act as a midpoint. Sorry, endpoint. Then controller-based endpoint can also serve as an endpoint. So there are basically three ways we know which we use as an endpoint. Okay. Next question is action method versus endpoint. So as I was talking about, like all action method are endpoints. Not all endpoints has to be action method all the time. Okay. There are different scenarios which I just explained. Like this control-based endpoint is also an endpoint. Minimal API endpoint is also an endpoint. But not all endpoint has to redirect always to the action method. So that's the key difference. And there are few more I have mentioned, but this particular 2 points are more than enough for you to clarify in the interview. Next is what is the difference between abstraction versus encapsulation? It's a very straightforward question. I think all juniors also know. Abstraction is hiding the implementation detail, and encapsulation is controlling the internal state. For example, let's say salary of different employee will be calculated differently. We cannot expose that property which represents salary to the outside world. Okay, so that has to be controlled. Let me explain you how we achieve that. So if we talk about abstraction, there are two ways basically we can achieve it. One is through interfaces. We define an interface and implementation detail will be implemented by a class which is going to implement that interface. Okay, that's one way of doing that. Interface will be defined, not how it's going to be achieved. That has to be defined by any other class. Now the other way is using the abstract class. Okay, where in the abstract class we will only define the method properties and the method what we call a class method. Okay, but we will not give the implementation detail will be doing is going to be done by the class which is going to inherit that. Same way, if we talk about encapsulation, it is the basically controlling the state of a particular class field or anything. If you see, as I said, let's say we are taking a banking example. The bank account balance should not be exposed to the outside world. It has to be internally adjusted and used. So what we do, we make that class field as private and do whatever we want to do inside a method which is going to be public. So other people can just invoke this. They cannot temper balance state. So that's what I meant when I say encapsulation help us to control the state. Let's look at the next question. The question was how middleware execution flow works. Okay. So whenever a request comes, it goes through all middlewares are basically component which are chained after one another. Okay, and the chain cannot be broken. So if let's say you have five middlewares, then all the middleware will be called one after the other. And in every middleware, it has got the ability to decide whether we want to make any changes before sending it to the, before basically passing the control to the next middleware or not. Or while even returning, do we have to make any changes or not? Okay. So every middleware is basically chained after one after the other. And then eventually, when it is returning back, again, it will follow the same sequence. Okay, so that's a very simple explanation of execution rule. You can, this will be more than enough in an interview. What kind of middleware have I used and why? This question was what kind of middleware have you used personally? So I explained all the middlewares which I have used personally. I have used authentication, authorization, logging, exception handling, CORS. Whenever you, let's say, your one domain is Angular, has got a different domain, and your backend is in different domain. Then, if they want to interact, then you have to enable CORS. Okay, so that's all about this question. Nothing very complicated. And I also reiterated how middleware pipeline actually works. Then, what is the difference between I action result versus I action result of T? So I action result of T helps us achieve the strongly typed return type. So if let's say you have an entity user, then returning that user as a response, you don't have to, do the conversion. It will be automatically done because of you already have strongly typed return type. These two are basically return type, but this one is the strongly type. And whenever we are using strongly type, it anyways makes our life easy. And when you're using an API, this is the preferred method because it helps us achieve faster documentation, getting the details better. It has got more insights. Right? So it's always preferred when you're dealing with APIs go with action result of T. Okay, next question was the difference between controller versus controller base and when will you use what? So I simply explained that whenever I am dealing with APIs, I will go with controller base. Whenever I'm dealing with MVC where I have to return some view, then I'll go with MVC controller. Because remember one thing, MVC controller also inherits from controller base. All it does is that it adds a partial view or basically the return type. I mean, it returns view uh, to the caller. What is the role of filters? Filter whenever we want to do some, you know, action method specific filtration. Filtration could be authorization, authentication, result we want to achieve in a different way. Then we can use filters. It's kind of a action level middleware. Middlewares are for globally, but when we want to make some changes or do some extra thing within controller for particular action method, then we make use of filters. Role of content negotiation. Content negotiation is nothing but the decision we make as a, you know, as somebody who is returning to our client request, looking at the request header, in which format we want to reply. We want to send the strippy response. It could be XML, it could be JSON, depending on, we will see. First of all, we have to check the accept header, that in which format client actually wants us to accept the formatting. So usually JSON and XML is the most preferred one. And again, we can configure it in the program.cs. Explain the difference between entity framework core two approaches. So there are two approaches we can use while dealing with entity framework core. So one is code first and one is database first. In code first, majority of the things, majority of the code we write in C sharp. Not majority, I can say entirely. We define the entity, we define DbContext, we define DbSet and everything. And corresponding to that, it will create databases, tables, rows, and everything. And other one is database first. So when we are dealing with the legacy application where database is already there, in order to work with C sharp cleanly and easily, we use this second approach, database first. Let me walk you through each one by one. Before understanding code first approach, let me help you understand few key terms which is definitely going to be used repeatedly. What is an entity class? Entity class is nothing but a, that represents a table and database. Okay, try to see what we write in the C sharp and what it actually gonna be converted into on SQL side. So when we define an entity class, it becomes the table. What is the property? Property is nothing but becomes the columns. Okay. What is DB context? This is what becomes the database. And what is the migration? It is the script that we make use of in order to run any query. If you see the examples, okay, we have created a entity class. These properties are there. Okay. This will become different columns. And there is a DB class, a DB context we define that eventually becomes the database. And at the end, we run the migration, eventually making us from C sharp code create entire database, column, foreign key, everything out there. So that's a very interesting thing. And please make sure that you at least try to have a hands-on on this. Okay, it'll be really nice. I mean, it's you can create a very small project where you can do the DB first because majority of the interviewer is gonna ask you a code first approach. I beg your pardon, not DB first. Code first approach is definitely gonna be asked in every interview. Next is what is tracking versus no tracking queries. So whenever let's say we are dealing with get values, where it was earlier and now, if let's say user has requested only to get particular value, we don't have to see what was there before we have fetched the value. So in those scenario, we must use no queries, no tracking queries, because tracking query is a good thing when we want to track the changes. If let's say any updation has happened, then we will be able to track. But in normal cases where we just want to see the get where we simply just want to get the values from database, we don't have to track it literally. So in those scenarios when a user has only requested getting the value, so just imagine like whenever an action method which is http get, then at that time avoid using the tracking one. That time you can use as no tracking. That has finally brought us to the end of this part. I'm sorry, guys. I mean, I'm really not feeling well, so please ignore if there is any voice glitches you might have encountered. In next coming videos, I will be sharing more questions on Angular, Azure, and in C Sharp as well, APIs. So a lot of things are coming. So please make sure that, and as I always say, please answer concrete, substantiate it with your real world experience and rock. All the very, very best. Okay, keep it subscribed. Today my voice was not good, but coming days I'll be making more and more contents. Thank you very much.